Vittorio Bellandi's hands would not stop shaking. He pressed them flat against the cold table of a roadside diner, trying to force them still, but his body would not listen to him anymore. For 20 years, men had listened to him. Now his own hands would not obey a simple order. Outside, rain fell in thin gray sheets over an empty parking lot. A single flickering sign read Route 9 Diner, and beneath it, a handwritten note taped to the glass door said open all night. It was almost 2 in the morning, and Vittorio was the only customer inside, sitting in the corner booth with his back against the wall, facing the door, the way he had trained himself to sit 30 years ago and never stopped. He was 51 years old. He had built something enormous out of nothing, block by block, favor by favor, until his name alone could empty a room or fill one. People used to call him the Hammer, not because he liked the name, but because nobody dared to call him anything softer. Tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight he was just a man in a wet coat, waiting to find out if he would see the sunrise. 3 hours earlier he had been in his own house, the one with the iron gates and the long driveway, when his second in command, a man named Enzo Marchetti, had looked him in the eye and told him it was over. Not with shouting, not with threats. Enzo had said it calmly, almost kindly, the way you tell an old friend that his dog has died. The other captains had already agreed. The empire Vittorio spent his whole life building now belonged to someone else, and the price of walking away quietly was supposed to be his life, not his freedom. He had escaped through the kitchen door with nothing but his car keys, his phone, and the clothes on his back. He drove for 2 hours without a plan, watching his mirrors more than the road, until his phone buzzed with a message that made his stomach drop. It was a single sentence from a number he did not recognize. "We know the diner on Route 9. Come quietly and it will be fast." He did not know how they already knew where he was, but that no longer mattered. What mattered was that somebody had followed him, or somebody inside his own circle had given away his habits, the same small roadside diner he used to stop at years ago when he needed to think in peace. Now that peace felt like a trap closing around him. He thought about running again, but his legs felt heavy, and some tired, defeated part of him whispered that there was nowhere left to run. So he sat in the corner booth, ordered black coffee he did not plan to drink, and waited to see which car would pull into the lot first, the police or the men sent to finish him. That was when he first noticed her. She came out from the kitchen carrying a fresh pot of coffee, moving with the unhurried calm of someone who had worked nights for a long time, and had stopped being surprised by anything that walked through that door. She was heavyset, somewhere in her 40s, with soft brown eyes and hair pulled back into a loose bun that had mostly come undone. Her name tag read Nora. She did not look like someone who mattered in a story like this. She looked like someone the world walked past every single day without noticing. Vittorio had spent his whole life reading people in seconds, deciding who was dangerous and who was not, who could be trusted and who needed to be watched. He glanced at Nora and dismissed her instantly, the way he had dismissed thousands of ordinary people before her. A waitress, background noise, nothing more. She refilled his cup even though he had barely touched it, and for a moment her eyes lingered on him a second too long. He assumed she was simply curious about the well-dressed stranger sitting alone at 2 in the morning, soaked from the rain, refusing to take off his coat even indoors. He looked away first, watching the parking lot instead, watching for headlights. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Every sound made him tense, the hum of the refrigerator, the buzz of the sign outside, the distant rumble of a truck passing on the highway. His mind kept circling back to Enzo's calm voice telling him it was over, and to the message on his phone promising that this would be fast. He wondered if fast meant painless, or if it simply meant efficient. He wondered if anyone would even remember his name in a year. He was so lost in his own thoughts that he almost missed the black SUV turning slowly into the lot, its headlights sweeping once across the diner windows before switching off. His whole body went rigid. He recognized the vehicle immediately, one of three that his own crew used for jobs that required silence and no witnesses. He had ridden in cars just like it more times than he could count, always on the other side of situations like this one. Two men stepped out, wearing dark overcoats against the rain, moving without any hurry at all, which was somehow worse than if they had rushed. Men who rushed were nervous. Men who walked slowly through rain toward a diner at 2 in the morning were certain of the outcome before they even opened the door. Vittorio's mind raced through every option he had left and found almost nothing. The kitchen exit was on the far side of the building, past the counter, past the waitress, past everything. The front door was the only one he could see, and the two men were walking straight toward it. There was no back way out that he knew of, no window large enough, no second exit sign glowing anywhere in sight. For the first time in decades, Vittorio Belandi understood completely and simply that he had run out of moves. He thought about his mother, long past, and how she used to warn him as a boy that a life built on fear eventually collects its debt. He had never believed her. Now, watching two men approach through the rain, he finally did. Then something happened that he could not have predicted in 100 years of predicting things for a living. Nora set down the coffee pot on the counter without a sound, walked past his table as if simply continuing her rounds, and dropped a folded paper napkin beside his hand. She did not slow down. She did not look at him. She moved straight toward the front counter, positioning herself directly between the door and his booth, picking up a stack of clean plates as if she had simply remembered a task. Vittorio stared at the napkin for half a second before unfolding it beneath the table out of sight. Two words were written on it in quick, slanted handwriting. Back door. His heart pounded. He almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A stranger, a woman who did not know his name, who had no reason at all to care whether he lived or vanished into the night, offering him the only chance he had left. He did not understand why she was doing it. He did not have time to understand. The bell above the front door jingled, sharp and bright in the quiet diner, and the two men in overcoats stepped inside, scanning the room with the flat, practiced eyes of people who had done this kind of work before. Nora turned to face them with an easy, tired smile, the kind of smile diner staff give to anyone who walks through the door at 2 in the morning, whether they are truckers or lost travelers or something far more dangerous. "Where would you boys like to sit?" she asked, her voice warm and unbothered, as if the entire world had not just narrowed down to this single frozen moment. One of the men, tall with a scar cutting through his eyebrow, said they were only looking for someone and described a man in his 50s, well-dressed, sitting alone. Nora tilted her head, thinking it over with theatrical slowness, and said she thought maybe someone like that had come in earlier and already left, though she could not be certain, since so many people pass through on rainy nights like this one. While she spoke, her tray of clean plates slipped from her hands and shattered across the tile floor, the sound exploding through the quiet diner like a gunshot. Both men flinched and turned toward the noise instinctively, their attention pulled completely away from the booth in the corner. Nora dropped to her knees with a groan, apologizing loudly, sweeping broken pieces together with her hands, drawing every eye in the room toward her clumsy accident. In that single, chaotic instant, Vittorio moved. He slid out of the booth low and fast, keeping his body below the line of the counter, and slipped through the swinging door into the kitchen before either man had a chance to look back toward his table. His heart hammered so hard he could hear it in his ears. Behind him, he heard Nora's voice continuing to apologize, continuing to fill the silence, giving him every extra second she possibly could. The kitchen was small, lit by a single buzzing fluorescent light, smelling of old grease and burnt coffee. A cook he had not even noticed earlier looked up from a pan with wide, startled eyes but said nothing, as if he had seen this exact kind of thing before and knew better than to ask questions. Vittorio spotted a metal door at the back, propped open slightly with a folded piece of cardboard to let in air, and pushed through it into the alley outside. Rain hit him immediately, cold and sharp, soaking through his coat within seconds. He pressed his back against the brick wall of the diner, breathing hard, listening for footsteps, for shouting, for anything that would tell him he had been discovered. Nothing came. Just the steady patter of rain on metal trash cans, and the distant hum of the highway. He forced himself to move, half walking, half running down the alley, putting distance between himself and the diner, before circling back through a row of parked delivery trucks to see what was happening from a safer angle. Through the front window, rain streaked and glowing yellow from the diner lights. He watched the two men speak with Nora for another minute before finally turning and walking back out to their SUV. They lingered by the vehicle, scanning the parking lot once, twice, before finally climbing in and pulling away into the dark. Vittorio stood frozen in the shadows between the trucks for a long time after the taillights disappeared, unable to process what had just happened. A stranger, a woman with nothing to gain and everything to lose, had risked her safety for a man she had known for less than half an hour. He did not understand it. In his world, nobody did anything without a reason, without a price attached somewhere beneath the surface. He searched his mind for what her angle could possibly be and found nothing that made sense. He waited another 20 minutes in the rain, watching the road for any sign that the men might return, before finally allowing himself to approach the diner again. His clothes were soaked through, his hands trembling now from cold as much as fear, and his mind was a storm of questions he did not know how to ask. He stepped back through the kitchen door, and the cook barely glanced at him this time, returning his attention to the stove without a word. Vittorio walked slowly into the main dining area, where Nora was calmly stacking the last of the unbroken plates behind the counter, as if the last 30 minutes had been nothing more than an ordinary shift. She looked up when she heard him approach and studied his face for a long moment, taking in the rain dripping from his coat, the exhaustion carved into every line of his expression, the disbelief he could not quite hide. "You should sit down before you fall down," she said simply, gesturing toward the corner booth he had left minutes earlier. He sank into the seat without arguing, his legs finally giving out from the weight of everything that had just happened. Nora disappeared briefly into the kitchen and returned with a fresh towel, setting it on the table in front of him along with a new cup of coffee, steam curling up into the cool diner air. "Why?" he finally managed to ask, his voice rougher than he intended. "Why would you do that for someone you don't even know?" Nora slid into the seat across from him without waiting for an invitation, folding her hands on the table the way someone does when they are settling in for a longer conversation than either of them had planned. She studied him for a moment before answering, her eyes calm and unafraid in a way that unsettled him more than any threat ever had. "Because I've spent my whole life being the person nobody notices," she said quietly. "And tonight, for the first time in a long while, I noticed someone who needed help before it was too late to matter." Vittorio had no response to that. He sat in silence, rain still dripping from his hair onto the table, staring at a woman who had just risked everything for a stranger, in a rundown diner on the edge of nowhere, on what was supposed to have been the last night of his life. Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady and endless, washing the parking lot clean, while inside, something in Vittorio Belandi's carefully guarded world had just quietly, permanently shifted. He did not know yet that this would be only the beginning. He did not know that the two men who left tonight would return, that the danger following him had not ended but only paused, or that the woman sitting across from him, the one the world had spent years walking past without a second glance, would soon become the only person standing between him and the end of everything he had left. All he knew, sitting there soaked and shaking in that corner booth, was that, for the first time in longer than he could remember, someone had chosen to help him simply because it was the right thing to do, and he had absolutely no idea what to do with that. Vittorio did not sleep that night. He sat in the corner booth until the sky outside turned from black to a dull, bruised gray, watching the empty road, waiting for headlights that never came. Nora did not ask him to leave. She refilled his coffee twice more, wiped down the counter, hummed quietly to herself while she worked, and let the silence between them stretch without trying to fill it with questions he was not ready to answer. When the morning cook arrived to begin the breakfast shift, Nora untied her apron, folded it over her arm, and looked at Vittorio with an expression that was somehow both gentle and firm at the same time. "You cannot stay here," she said. "Not because I mind, but because if those men come back in daylight, there will be nowhere for you to hide." He knew she was right. He had spent his whole career thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else, and now a woman who poured coffee for a living was doing the thinking for both of them, and doing it well. He asked her, almost embarrassed by how small his voice sounded, if she knew anywhere he could go. Nora studied him for a long moment, the same careful, searching look she had given him hours earlier, as if she were still deciding something important about him that had nothing to do with the danger following him. Then she said the words that would change the next several days of his life completely. "You can stay with me. It is not much, but it is safe, and nobody would think to look for a man like you in a place like mine." He wanted to refuse. Every instinct built over decades told him not to trust anyone, not to depend on anyone, especially not a stranger who owed him nothing. But he had no car worth using, no phone he trusted to keep on, no friend left who had not already chosen a side against him, and no other offer on the table. So he nodded and followed her out through the back door into the pale morning light, feeling smaller and more exposed than he had felt in 30 years. Nora's apartment was above a small laundromat on a quiet street lined with old brick buildings and leaning telephone poles. The stairs creaked under their feet as they climbed, and the hallway smelled faintly of fabric softener drifting up from below. Inside, the apartment was small but tidy, with a worn couch, a kitchen table with 2 mismatched chairs, and photographs on the wall of a man Vittorio did not recognize, smiling in a fishing boat, smiling at a birthday party, smiling in a way that suggested he was no longer part of Nora's life except in memory. "That is my husband," Nora said, catching him looking. "He passed 3 years ago. Heart problem nobody caught in time. I still have not found the courage to take the pictures down." Vittorio offered a quiet apology, unsure what else to say. Nora waved it off gently and gestured for him to sit at the small kitchen table while she moved into the kitchen to make something simple to eat. He watched her work, cracking eggs into a pan, humming the same tune from earlier, and found himself struck by how ordinary the moment felt despite everything happening around it. For the first time in longer than he could remember, nobody was watching him, weighing him, deciding what he was worth to them. He was simply a man sitting at a kitchen table, waiting for breakfast. Over the following hours, and then days, a strange kind of routine formed between them. Nora worked her shifts at the diner in the evenings and returned each morning exhausted but steady, bringing him small updates about anything unusual she had noticed. Strange cars parked too long on quiet streets, questions asked by customers who did not quite fit in, rumors passed along by regulars who knew everyone and everything happening within 20 miles. Vittorio, unable to risk going outside, spent his days pacing the small apartment, staring at the ceiling, and slowly, unwillingly, opening up about a life he had never once discussed with anyone outside his own world. He told her about growing up poor, about a father who drank too much and hit too easily, about how he had promised himself as a boy that nobody would ever again have power over him the way his father once did. He told her how that promise had slowly twisted itself into something ugly over the years, how protecting himself had become about controlling everyone around him, until he woke up one day as a man feared by hundreds and trusted by almost none. Nora listened without judgment but also without excusing him. She asked hard questions, the kind nobody in his old life would have dared to ask. She wanted to know if he had ever once, in 30 years, done something simply because it was right, rather than because it was useful. He sat with that question for a long time before admitting, quietly, that he could not remember a single time. In return, she told him about her own life, about growing up the youngest of 5 children in a house where nobody had enough attention to spare, about how she learned early to take care of herself because nobody else was going to do it for her. She told him about her husband, a quiet mechanic named Walter who never made much money but always made her laugh, and about the debt he left behind when he passed, medical bills that ate up every spare dollar she earned, forcing her into double shifts just to keep the lights on. She told him she had learned, over the years, what it felt like to be invisible, to be looked past by people who assumed she had nothing interesting to offer, and how that invisibility, strangely enough, had become useful in unexpected ways. "Nobody suspects the waitress," she said one evening, arranging her hair before heading out for her shift. "Nobody remembers the woman who topped off their coffee. That means I hear everything and nobody thinks twice about it." Vittorio began to understand slowly that Nora was not simply a kind stranger who happened to help him out of pity. She was sharp, observant, and quietly resourceful in ways that had nothing to do with the world he came from and everything to do with a different kind of intelligence entirely. She noticed details he would have missed, remembered names and faces after hearing them only once, and pieced together patterns from scattered conversations that most people would never think to connect. On the third night, Nora came home later than usual, her expression tighter than he had seen it before. She told him that 2 men had come into the diner asking questions again, not the same 2 from before but new faces, describing him in more detail this time, mentioning a scar on his hand that only someone close to him would know about. Vittorio's stomach turned cold. It meant someone inside his old circle, someone who had once called him a friend, was actively helping hunt him down. He wanted to leave immediately, to spare her any further danger, but Nora refused to hear it. She said that running blindly into the night with no plan and no resources would only get him caught faster, and that leaving her apartment now would not undo the risk she had already taken to help him. It would only waste it. She told him, with a firmness that surprised him, that she had made her choice the moment she slid that napkin across the table, and she did not intend to abandon it now simply because things had become harder. Vittorio found himself staring at her with something close to awe. In his old world, loyalty was bought, enforced, or eventually betrayed. Here was a woman offering it freely, without payment, without threat, simply because she believed it was the right thing to do. He did not know how to process a kind of loyalty that asked for nothing in return. Over the next 2 days, Nora began quietly gathering information through her network of regulars at the diner, people Vittorio would never have thought to approach in his old life. A tired night shift police officer who stopped by for coffee before his patrol, a mechanic who fixed cars for half the town and heard every piece of gossip while doing it, a soft-spoken bail bondsman who knew which faces belonged to which criminal circles better than anyone else in the area. None of them knew who Vittorio truly was. Nora simply asked careful, casual questions, framing her curiosity as harmless small talk, and pieced together fragments of information that painted an increasingly clear picture of the danger closing in around them. She learned that the men hunting Vittorio were being led by Enzo Marchetti himself, the very man who had once stood at Vittorio's side for over a decade before turning against him. She learned that Enzo had promised a significant reward to anyone who found Vittorio first, and that the search had expanded beyond the immediate area, with men now checking motels, bus stations, and diners across 3 counties. She learned, most troubling of all, that Enzo suspected Vittorio had not left town at all, and had begun quietly pressuring local businesses to report anything unusual. Vittorio listened to each update with a growing sense of dread mixed with something he had not expected to feel, gratitude. He realized that without Nora's careful, patient information gathering, He would have had no idea how close the danger truly was until it arrived at her front door. He also realized, uncomfortably, that he had spent his entire adult life surrounded by men who called themselves loyal, while quietly measuring his worth against their own ambitions, and none of them had ever protected him with the quiet, unglamorous determination that this waitress showed him without hesitation. On the fifth night, as Nora prepared to leave for her shift, she paused at the door and turned back to look at him. "You are not the man they described to me that first day," she said. "You are not the man they are hunting, not anymore, not in this apartment. I do not know what you will choose to do once this is over, but I know that the man sitting in my kitchen tonight is not the same one who walked into my diner soaked and terrified less than a week ago." Vittorio did not have an answer for her. He simply nodded, watching her disappear down the creaking stairs, and sat alone in the quiet apartment turning her words over in his mind long after the sound of her footsteps had faded away. Somewhere out there, men were combing the town searching for a version of him that no longer entirely existed, and the only person standing between him and their reach was a woman the world had spent years failing to notice, now quietly, carefully, outmaneuvering all of them. The knock on the door came just before midnight, 3 sharp raps that made Vittorio's entire body go still. Nora was not due back from her shift for another hour, and nobody else knew he was staying in this apartment, or at least, nobody was supposed to know. He stood frozen in the small living room, listening, calculating his options in the space of a single held breath. There was a narrow window at the back of the apartment that led out onto a metal fire escape, but reaching it would mean crossing directly past the front door, in full view of whoever stood on the other side. The knock came again, softer this time, followed by a low voice he did not recognize. "It's Daniel," the voice said. "Nora sent me. Open up, quick." Vittorio hesitated, torn between suspicion and the fact that whoever this was knew Nora's name and seemed to know she was not home. He crossed the room carefully, positioning himself to the side of the door rather than directly in front of it, and asked in a low voice how he could be sure this was not a trick. The man on the other side answered without missing a beat. "Because if I wanted you dead, I would not have knocked, and Nora would not have handed me her spare key 3 days ago in case something like this happened." Something in the calm, tired practicality of that answer convinced Vittorio more than any password could have. He opened the door to find a man in his 40s, wearing a plain jacket over a police uniform shirt, his badge clipped to his belt, his expression tight with urgency rather than hostility. This was Daniel Pierce, the night shift officer Nora had mentioned days earlier, the one who stopped by the diner for coffee before his patrols. "Get your things," Daniel said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. 2 cars just pulled up outside the diner. Nora spotted them through the kitchen window and called me instead of finishing her shift. She is stalling them right now, but they are asking about this address specifically, which means someone talked. Vittorio's stomach dropped. There was nothing to gather, no bag, no belongings beyond the clothes on his back, but the news hit him like a blow all the same. Someone had traced him here, to the one place he thought was safe, and Nora was standing directly between danger and the apartment where he had been hiding for days. "We need to go to her," he said immediately, already moving toward the door. Daniel caught his arm, not roughly but firmly enough to stop him. "Going there gets both of you caught," he said. "Nora told me exactly what to do if this happened. She has a plan, trust it." Vittorio wanted to argue, every instinct screaming at him to protect the one person who had risked everything for him, but something in Daniel's steady, certain tone made him pause. He forced himself to nod, and followed the officer down the back stairwell into a narrow alley behind the laundromat, where an unmarked car waited with its engine already running. As they drove through the quiet streets, headlights off until they reached the main road, Daniel explained what little he knew. Nora had prepared for this possibility from the very first night, worried that hiding Vittorio in her own apartment carried real risk, and had quietly arranged a backup plan with the small circle of people she trusted completely. If danger ever arrived at her door, she would stall for time using the same calm, unremarkable presence that made her invisible to dangerous men in the first place, while Daniel moved Vittorio somewhere safer. They arrived 20 minutes later at a small auto repair garage on the edge of town, dark and quiet at this late hour, the metal shutters pulled down over the front windows. Daniel used a key to open a side door, leading Vittorio inside past rows of parked cars in various states of repair, back to a small office with a cot pushed against one wall. "This belongs to Frank," Daniel explained. "He fixes half the cars in this town and asks fewer questions than anyone else I know. You will be safe here for tonight." Vittorio sat on the edge of the cot, his mind consumed entirely with worry for Nora, and asked Daniel bluntly if she was truly safe, or if he had simply been told that to keep him calm and cooperative. Daniel studied him for a long moment before answering honestly. He said that Nora was smart and careful, and had survived plenty of difficult situations in her life without anyone's help, but that did not mean the danger she faced tonight was small. He admitted, plainly, that he was worried too, but that panicking and rushing back toward her would only make things more dangerous for everyone involved. Vittorio spent the rest of that night awake, sitting in the dim office, listening to every distant sound, imagining every possible outcome of what might be happening back at the diner. He thought about the years he had spent building an empire meant to keep him safe, surrounded by armed men and reinforced doors and layers of protection, and how none of it had ever felt as fragile as this single night, waiting helplessly while a woman with nothing but her wits stood between danger and everything he had left. Nora arrived at the garage just before dawn, exhausted, her uniform slightly wrinkled but unharmed. Vittorio rose immediately when he saw her, relief flooding through him so intensely that for a moment he could not speak at all. She offered him a tired smile and dropped into the chair across from him, explaining what had happened while Daniel listened quietly nearby. The men who arrived at the diner, she explained, had not come from Enzo's inner circle directly, but from a lower-level crew hired to canvass nearby businesses. She had recognized one of them from a photograph Daniel once showed her, connected to a case he had worked years earlier, and had immediately understood the danger. Rather than run or show fear, she leaned into her ordinary role completely, playing the exhausted, unremarkable waitress even more convincingly than usual, offering the men coffee, complaining about slow tips, and steering the conversation toward harmless small talk until they grew bored and left to search elsewhere. They asked about the apartment above the laundromat, she admitted, her voice tightening slightly. "Someone must have seen you and me together at some point and put it together. I told them I used to live there but moved out months ago after a bad breakup. I do not know if they believed me completely, but it bought us time." Vittorio felt a fresh wave of guilt settle over him, heavier than before. He told her plainly that he could not keep putting her in danger like this, that every day he stayed connected to her life brought her closer to the same fate that had nearly claimed him. Nora listened patiently, then shook her head with quiet firmness. "If I wanted to walk away," she said, "I would have done it that first night in the diner. I did not help you because I thought it would be easy. I helped you because I believed it mattered. That has not changed." Daniel, standing near the office door, added quietly that Nora's information gathering over the past few days had actually given them something valuable. A clearer picture of exactly how Enzo's search was organized, which crews were covering which neighborhoods, and roughly how much time remained before the search expanded to cover every remaining corner of town. It was not victory, but it was an advantage, one built entirely from Nora's careful attention, and the trust she had quietly earned from ordinary people across the community who had no idea how important their small observations had become. Vittorio sat with that thought for a long moment, watching Nora rest her head briefly against the wall, eyes closed, clearly running on nothing but determination at this point. He realized with a clarity that startled him that everything he had built over 30 years, every alliance bought with fear, and every loyalty enforced through threat, had crumbled within a single week the moment real pressure arrived. Yet here was a woman with no army, no money, and no power beyond her own resourcefulness, holding together a fragile web of protection through nothing but genuine trust and quiet courage. He did not know yet exactly how the coming days would unfold, or whether Enzo's search would eventually succeed despite everything Nora and her small circle of allies were doing to prevent it. But sitting in that dim garage office as dawn light began to creep through the gaps in the metal shutters, Vittorio understood something he had never fully grasped in 3 decades of building an empire on fear. Real protection, the kind that held steady even under the worst pressure, was never something that could be bought. It had to be earned quietly, one honest choice at a time, and somehow, against every instinct in his old life, he had found himself surrounded by exactly that. 3 days after the close call at the diner, Enzo Marchetti made his first mistake, and it was Nora who noticed it before anyone else did. She had gone back to work at the diner despite Vittorio's protests, insisting that stopping her shifts entirely would draw more suspicion than continuing them, and that her presence there gave her the best possible vantage point for gathering information. It was during the slow hour before closing that a familiar face walked through the door, a heavy-set man named Carlo who used to stop by occasionally for pie and coffee, always polite, always tipping well. Someone Nora had spoken with dozens of times over the years without ever knowing his connection to Vittorio's old organization. Carlo looked tired that night, and a little too talkative for someone usually so quiet. Over slices of cherry pie, he mentioned, almost carelessly, that things had gotten complicated at work, that some of the older crew members were unhappy about how Enzo had taken control, and that a meeting was being planned for the following night at a warehouse near the old rail yard to settle some disagreements about how the search for Vittorio should continue. Nora filed every word away carefully, nodding along with polite interest, refilling his coffee, asking harmless follow-up questions that revealed just enough detail without seeming suspicious. By the time Carlo finished his pie and left, she had learned the location, the approximate time, and the fact that not everyone in Enzo's crew was fully behind him anymore. She relayed everything to Vittorio that night at the garage, watching his expression shift from surprise to something sharper, more calculating, a flicker of the man he used to be before all of this began. He explained that disagreements like the ones Carlo mentioned were common in the early days after any change in leadership, when loyalty was still unsettled and old resentments had not yet been buried. If even a few of his former men were questioning Enzo's methods, that crack could be widened. Daniel, listening from across the small office, pointed out the obvious danger in that plan. Getting anywhere near a meeting of armed men actively hunting him was reckless beyond reason, and even if Vittorio managed to avoid capture, there was no guarantee any of his old crew would side with him now that everything had changed. Vittorio agreed the risk was real, but explained that doing nothing carried its own danger, since Enzo's search would only grow more thorough with each passing day. And eventually, no amount of careful stalling from Nora or her circle of allies would be enough to keep him hidden. Nora suggested something none of them had considered, an alternative that did not require Vittorio to go anywhere near the warehouse at all. If Carlo had let slip information about internal disagreements once, over pie and idle conversation, he might do it again, especially if given a gentle nudge in the right direction. She proposed continuing to build a relationship with Carlo through the diner, carefully steering conversations toward the tension within Enzo's crew, gathering enough information over the coming days to understand exactly how divided the organization truly was, and whether that division could be used to end the search entirely without anyone needing to set foot near danger. Vittorio recognized immediately what she was suggesting: a slow, careful campaign of information gathering disguised entirely as harmless small talk, the exact kind of quiet, invisible work Nora had already proven herself brilliant at. He found himself almost smiling despite everything, struck once again by how naturally she understood strategy without ever having lived the kind of life that usually taught such lessons. Over the following week, Nora's careful conversations with Carlo, along with occasional details gathered from other regulars at the diner, began to paint a clearer picture. Enzo's takeover had not gone as smoothly as he wanted the wider organization to believe. Several senior members felt he had moved too quickly, breaking promises made during the transition, redirecting money and territory toward his own closest allies, while sidelining others who had been loyal to Vittorio for decades. The hunt for Vittorio, rather than uniting the crew behind Enzo, had actually become a source of growing resentment, since it required resources and attention that some members felt should be spent elsewhere. Vittorio listened to each update with growing focus, piecing together names and grievances from his years of experience running the very organization now fracturing without him. He began to see an opportunity forming, not the kind of opportunity his old self would have recognized, built on threats and forced loyalty, but something quieter and, in its own way, more powerful. If he could reach even a handful of the more disillusioned members and offer them a reason to doubt Enzo's leadership publicly, the search for him might collapse from the inside before it ever needed to reach a violent conclusion. The challenge was reaching anyone from his old crew without exposing himself to immediate danger. Nora offered to help there as well, suggesting that Daniel, given his position and the trust he had built with certain contacts over the years working night patrol, might be able to pass along a message quietly, framed carefully enough not to reveal exactly where Vittorio was hiding. Daniel agreed, cautiously, understanding the risk to his own position if anyone discovered his involvement, but stating plainly that he had grown to respect what Nora and Vittorio were trying to accomplish, and that ending this standoff without further danger was worth some personal risk on his part. He reached out carefully to a low-level contact, connected loosely to Vittorio's old organization, someone he had crossed paths with professionally in the past, framing his questions as casual curiosity about unusual activity happening around town. The message worked its way slowly through unofficial channels, exactly as they hoped, until it reached the ears of a man named Frank Dobbs, not the mechanic who owned the garage, but a completely different Frank, one of Vittorio's oldest and most trusted lieutenants from years ago, someone who had grown increasingly uneasy about Enzo's leadership since the very night of the takeover. Frank sent word back through the same careful, indirect channel, expressing cautious interest in speaking, provided it could be arranged somewhere safe for everyone involved. Vittorio felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in over a week: cautious hope. He understood the enormous risk involved in trusting anyone connected to his old world again, especially so soon after being betrayed by a man he trusted for over a decade. Nora noticed his hesitation and did not push him toward any particular decision, instead reminding him gently that trust, once broken, had to be rebuilt slowly and carefully, testing small steps before committing to anything larger. They arranged a cautious first meeting, not with Frank directly, but through a series of careful, indirect exchanges managed entirely by Daniel, designed to establish enough trust before risking any face-to-face contact. Over several tense days, messages passed back and forth, testing sincerity, confirming details only someone genuinely connected to the old organization would know, slowly building toward the possibility of an actual meeting. Meanwhile, Nora continued her quiet work at the diner, maintaining her ordinary routine even as the pressure around them intensified. She noticed, with growing concern, that the men searching for Vittorio seemed to be expanding their efforts once again, checking businesses they had already visited before, asking sharper, more specific questions this time. She suspected Enzo was growing impatient, perhaps sensing that something was shifting within his own organization, and had decided to increase pressure everywhere at once rather than risk losing control entirely. One evening, as she wiped down the counter near closing time, a woman she did not recognize sat down at the far end and ordered coffee, watching Nora with an attention that felt different from the usual customers, sharper, more deliberate. Nora's instincts, honed sharp after weeks of careful observation, immediately flagged something wrong. The woman asked casual questions about how long Nora had worked there, whether she lived nearby, whether she had noticed any unusual faces around town recently, questions that on the surface seemed harmless but carried an undertone Nora recognized immediately from her recent experience. Rather than panic, Nora leaned into her practiced role completely, offering vague, unremarkable answers, complaining about slow business and tired feet, giving the woman nothing useful while appearing entirely open and cooperative. The woman eventually left without incident, but Nora reported the encounter to Vittorio and Daniel that same night, warning them that Enzo's search had likely widened to include people specifically watching her, not just the diner itself. The news landed heavily. It meant Nora herself was no longer simply a helpful bystander in this situation, but an active target, someone whose connection to Vittorio had likely been at least partially confirmed. Vittorio felt the familiar guilt rising again, sharper this time, knowing that his presence in her life had transformed her from an invisible waitress into someone dangerous people were actively watching. Nora, sensing his spiraling thoughts, stopped him firmly before he could suggest leaving again to protect her. She reminded him that they were closer now than ever to reaching Frank and the disgruntled members of his old crew, that abandoning the plan now out of fear would only leave both of them vulnerable with nothing gained. She insisted that the best way to protect herself and him was to finish what they had started, using the very same careful, patient strategy that had gotten them this far. Vittorio looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had transformed from a stranger pouring coffee into someone, directing a careful, dangerous operation with more skill and courage than half the men he had once called loyal. He nodded slowly, agreeing to continue, but promised himself quietly that whatever happened next, he would find a way to make sure the danger following him did not end up costing her everything. 2 days later, word finally came back through Daniel's careful channel that Frank Dobbs was willing to meet, in person, at a location he would choose himself for safety, to discuss what he called a growing problem within the organization that needed to be addressed before it spiraled further out of control. The message included a warning as well, one that made Vittorio's chest tighten with new urgency. Enzo, Frank explained, had grown suspicious that Vittorio was still hiding somewhere in town, and had decided to personally lead a final, more aggressive search beginning within the week, determined to end the matter once and for all before his own crew's growing doubts could spread any further. The meeting with Frank Dobbs took place 2 nights later, in the back room of a small storage facility on the outskirts of town, chosen because it belonged to a distant cousin of Frank's who asked no questions and kept no records worth mentioning. Vittorio arrived with Daniel, both of them tense, watching every shadow, while Nora waited nearby in a parked car down the street, insisting she would not simply sit at home while the outcome of everything they had worked toward was decided somewhere she could not see. Frank looked older than Vittorio remembered, more tired, deep lines etched around his eyes that had not been there during their years working side by side. He greeted Vittorio with a stiff, careful nod, neither warm nor hostile, the greeting of a man still deciding where his loyalty truly belonged. He explained plainly that he had not come to pledge allegiance or promise support, only to share information and hear, directly, whether the man in front of him was still someone worth listening to. Vittorio, stripped of the power and fear that once surrounded every conversation he had, found himself speaking more honestly than he had in years. He admitted that Enzo's takeover had partly succeeded because Vittorio himself had grown careless, trusting loyalty that was bought rather than earned, ignoring the same kind of quiet resentment now clearly fracturing the crew from within. He did not ask Frank to fight for him or risk anything on his behalf. He simply asked what Frank believed was fair, both for the organization and for the people caught in the middle of a conflict none of them had chosen. Frank listened carefully, weighing every word, before finally admitting that several senior members, himself included, had grown deeply uncomfortable with how far Enzo was willing to go to secure his position, redirecting resources meant for the wider organization toward hunting down a single man who no longer even wanted power back. He revealed that Enzo's aggressive new search plan, set to begin within days, involved pressuring innocent business owners across town, threatening families, and using far more force than the situation actually required, tactics that even hardened men within the crew found difficult to accept. This, Frank explained, was the opening they needed. If enough senior members witnessed firsthand how far Enzo was willing to go, especially against ordinary people with no real connection to their world, it might be enough to turn the tide of loyalty away from him entirely, without requiring any dramatic confrontation at all. Vittorio proposed something carefully, testing the idea gently rather than presenting it as a demand. If Frank and the others could delay Enzo's aggressive search just long enough, and if Vittorio could arrange to be seen briefly, safely, in a way that demonstrated he was not hiding out of weakness, but calmly, deliberately allowing the truth about Enzo's leadership to surface on its own, it might convince the wavering members of the crew to formally withdraw their support before violence became necessary. Frank considered this for a long moment before agreeing, cautiously, to help arrange exactly that opportunity, provided everything was handled with extreme care. He explained that a larger gathering of senior crew members was already scheduled in 4 days, originally meant to finalize plans for the expanded search, but which could instead become the moment everything shifted, if handled correctly. Over the following days, Nora's steady information gathering combined with Daniel's careful outside connections and Frank's growing network of quietly doubtful allies to build toward that single, crucial night. Nora continued working her shifts at the diner as though nothing unusual was happening, though the strain of the past weeks had clearly begun to wear on her, dark circles forming beneath her eyes, her hands sometimes trembling slightly from exhaustion and stress she refused to fully admit to anyone. Vittorio noticed, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, found himself worrying about someone else's well-being more than his own safety. He told her plainly, one quiet evening at the garage, that regardless of how the coming days unfolded, he intended to make sure she never had to work double shifts again out of desperation, that whatever resources remained to him, once this was resolved, would go toward paying off the debts weighing her down. Nora waved him off gently, insisting she had not helped him for any kind of reward, but Vittorio held firm, telling her that some debts were not about reward at all, but about simple, overdue fairness. On the night of the gathering, tension hung thick in the air as Vittorio, accompanied carefully by Frank and 2 other senior members who had quietly agreed to support the plan, arrived at the same warehouse near the old rail yard that Carlo had mentioned weeks earlier. Enzo stood near the center of the room, surrounded by loyal allies, clearly stunned to see Vittorio walk in calmly, without hiding, without fear, exactly as they had planned. The room fell into a heavy, uncertain silence as Vittorio addressed the gathered crew, not with threats or demands, but with a calm honesty none of them expected from him. He acknowledged his own mistakes openly, admitted that the fear-based loyalty he once relied on had ultimately failed everyone, including himself, and stated plainly that he had no intention of reclaiming control through force or intimidation. He simply wanted the aggressive, dangerous search targeting innocent people across town to end, and for the organization to move forward without further unnecessary harm. Enzo, furious and clearly unsettled by the shifting mood in the room, attempted to regain control of the conversation, accusing Vittorio of manipulation and cowardice, insisting that his own leadership had already secured the loyalty of everyone present. But the uncomfortable silence that followed told a different story, as several senior members exchanged uncertain glances, clearly weighing the difference between the calm, honest man standing before them now and the increasingly reckless leader who had spent weeks pressuring innocent families in a search built entirely on fear. Frank stepped forward then, speaking plainly to the gathered crew about the concerns many of them had already voiced privately over the past week, about resources wasted, about innocent people threatened unnecessarily, about a leadership style that prioritized personal power over the well-being of the organization as a whole. One by one, several other senior members added their own quiet agreement, and within minutes, the balance of the room shifted decisively away from Enzo, who stood increasingly isolated as his own closest allies hesitated to openly defend him. Recognizing that his position had crumbled beyond recovery, Enzo made one final, desperate attempt to salvage control, but found no support left in the room willing to back him. Faced with the undeniable reality that his leadership had collapsed from within, he was forced to step back, stripped of authority by the very people he had once convinced to follow him, without a single act of violence required to settle the matter. In the days that followed, the organization Vittorio once led began quietly dissolving on its own terms, senior members negotiating peaceful separations, redirecting resources toward legitimate business interests many of them had quietly built over the years as backup plans, finally free from the constant threat and manipulation that had defined their world for so long. Vittorio himself formally stepped away from any remaining involvement, choosing instead to disappear from that world entirely, a decision that surprised absolutely everyone who had once known him as a man defined completely by power. Nora was there the night he made that choice final, sitting across from him once again at the same small kitchen table where this entire unlikely story had truly begun. He told her plainly that he intended to use whatever resources remained to him, quietly and without fanfare, to pay off every debt weighing her down, to make sure she never again had to work herself to exhaustion simply to survive. He told her that regardless of what came next in his own uncertain future, he wanted her to know that her kindness on a rainy night in a rundown diner had changed the entire direction of his life, and he did not intend to let that kindness go unanswered. Months later, the Route 9 diner looked much the same as it always had, the same flickering sign, the same worn booths, the same steady hum of quiet, ordinary life passing through its doors each night. But there was a small brass plaque now mounted near the counter, simple and unassuming, easy for most customers to overlook entirely. Only Nora, and the man who occasionally still stopped by for black coffee late at night, understood exactly what those few quiet words engraved into the metal truly meant. A small, permanent reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is simply the choice to notice someone else's pain, and to do something about it, even when nobody is watching, and even when doing so costs everything you thought you had left to lose.